is an overview of U.S. Policy in the Caribbean and Latin America for 1998, our agenda, in fact. This, as you may know, may not be the hottest political topic in the United States today.
The second hottest.
The second, yeah. But all of you know its great importance. But a facet, of course, is the visit of the Pope, which has also made a historic visit, as we all know, to Cuba, which was part of the presentation, a great confrontation of atheism and religion, which some people has been overshadowed, but paradoxically, perhaps with the intense interest, no one will ever forget the week in which the Pope's visit was overshadowed. And in that sense, we may really be reflective about the Pope's visit. But we're delighted to be addressing this topic tonight as a policy of the Council, as you all know, to not only try to look at the very most important questions, but also to always have a broad geographic perspective on the important and the unimportant in foreign affairs. And our topic tonight includes some very huge questions as well as some secondary questions. But Ambassador Romero has been good enough to join us. As you know, he's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs. He's a graduate of Florida State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in 1971, a Master of Arts in International Relations in 1972, and he's been a resident of Maryland since 1972. He's been an educator, and he's been a consultant with the Labor Department, where he had numerous awards, and became a Foreign Service officer in 1977. He served in Santo Domingo, in Naples, in Rome, in Washington, and San Salvador. And in the last two sets of assignments from 1988 to 93, he was involved in the negotiations with the guerrilla groups in El Salvador. And we in the past have had a couple of programs on that, as you may remember. And the opposition leader, when we first had him, as you recall, was profoundly in support of military action, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union was a profound advocate of conciliation. But that's a period of time which the ambassador has experienced. His last tour was in Ecuador as the ambassador from 93 to 96, and he was involved to a great extent with the encouragement of American business in Ecuador. He assumed his present post in September of 96, and we're just absolutely delighted. He has a wonderful reputation. His presentations are well known, and we're very fortunate to have him with us this evening. Ambassador Romero.
Thank you so much, President Byrd, and I'd like to thank you and all of the organizers of the Council who've invited me here. It's delightful to leave one beltway or inside the beltway, even if it is to come to another, particularly in the last couple of days. What I'd like to do, I'm a career Foreign Service officer, and while Latin America was perhaps the second best story going last week, I'd like to give you the perspectives of someone from the second oldest profession in the world. When it comes to Latin America, I think that most of us kind of view, I think as a people we understand less what goes on south of the border than we do elsewhere. And oftentimes our view of what goes on south of the border is predicated on kind of a filter of Mexico. And for better or for worse, our relationship with Mexico seems to be very much the overriding characteristic or filter by which we look at South America. But there are some very exciting things going on, and I had an opportunity today to talk to some editorial writers for the Baltimore Sun, along with the Secretary for Foreign Commerce of the state of Maryland. And so there's some very exciting things going on in the state of Maryland vis-a-vis Latin America and overseas markets. But when it comes to Latin America, much of our post-Cold War agenda has been encapsulated in the Miami Summit process. The Miami Summit of 1994 established fundamental hemispheric consensus in favor of democracy, market-based economies, and shared growth. Since then, we've been moving forward on the specific initiatives launched in Miami through a process of regular reviews preparatory to the next summit meeting in Santiago this April. The Santiago Summit will launch negotiations for the establishment of a free trade area of the Americas, commonly referred to as FTAA, as was agreed by the hemisphere's trade ministers in Belo Horizonte, Brazil last May. There are still a number of issues concerning the structure and scheduling of the negotiations that the trade ministers must resolve at their next meeting in Costa Rica in March. But make no mistake, we will be launching serious negotiations for the establishment of a free trade agreement in the hemisphere by the year 2005. However, short-term problems exist, most notably the current turbulence in some Latin American stock markets, and from our perspective, and regrettably, the absence of fast-track authority for the President. However, FTAA is intended to build a long-term partnership among the nations of the hemisphere with all our diversity of culture, size, and level of development. And the long-term economic fundamentals are strong. First, growth remains solid. Most observers estimate that growth for the next several years within the region will remain about 4% per annum. Inflation continues to decline. Estimates of inflation for the 1997 average around 12%, the lowest in 50 years. Capital continues to flow into the region with a growing proportion in long-term investments vis-a-vis or as opposed to the maquiladora type investments that the region has seen over the last several years. The financial structure of the region is much improved. The World Bank has pointed out that most Latin American countries today would meet the criteria established by the Maastricht Agreement for the European Union. What that means is a fiscal deficit of no more than 3% of GDP. This is a huge improvement over even the recent past when Mexico, with all of its oil reserves, had a deficit in 1994 of 7% of GDP. Fifth, and perhaps most important from the perspective of foreign investors, there has been a striking improvement in financial and economic transparency. Argentina, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile have all signed up to the IMF's new international trade transparency standards, and they now post financial and economic data on the internet. Sixth, there's been a steady movement towards trade liberalization, economic integration, and regional cooperation. Besides the FTAA negotiations, we have seen a rise of sub-regional arrangements like Mercosur, the Andean Pact, the Central American System of Integration, the CARICOM. However, nowhere else in the developing world has there been agreement on an action plan as broad and comprehensive as that embodied in our hemispheric summit process. When the leaders meet again in Santiago this April, they will review progress in 4 areas of additional action, including education, universality of education, democracy, strengthening democratic institutions, human rights, universal acceptance of basic human rights standards, economic integration, poverty, and discrimination. But much still remains to be done. Some countries still need to complete relatively basic reforms, particularly monetary and fiscal improvements necessary to achieve stability and create a positive investment climate. Most countries in the hemisphere have only started on the process of making more fundamental long-term improvements, such as restructuring the tax and financial sectors to stimulate savings and channel investment, modernizing government mechanisms for greater responsiveness and efficiency, and establishing genuinely transparent legal and regulatory codes. Nearly every country in the region must come to terms with the fundamental economic and political problems of poverty and income equality or income distribution. For liberal trade regimes and the market model to be successful in Latin America, to say nothing of much profounder issues of democracy and political stability, the benefits of growth must be available to every level of society. This means that governments in the hemisphere must commit themselves to greater job creation, education, and improved healthcare systems. There is no question that the movement towards free trade has had tremendous advantages for the nations of Latin America. Look, for example, at the experiences of Mexico in 1982, pre-NAFTA, and in 1995. Following the 1982 financial crisis, it took 5 years for Mexican output to return to pre-crisis levels. With NAFTA in place following the 1995 crisis, Mexican output rebounded in 2 years. The results of economic liberalization have been similarly dramatic in other countries of the hemisphere. The decline of per capita GDP that plagued Latin America in the 80s has been replaced by steady growth in this decade. Inflation, which, for example, in 1980 was 1,585% per year in Brazil and 1,344% in Argentina, was down to 11% in Brazil and less than 1% in Argentina in 1996. The implications for the United States are, if anything, even more dramatic. Latin America and the Caribbean have a combined annual GDP of about $1.7 trillion. The 500 million consumers in this market purchase more than 40% of their imports from the United States. What that means is for every import dollar that a Latin American spends, 40% is spent on U.S. products. As a result of the movement towards free trade, U.S. exports to the region grew more than 200% in the first 6 years of this decade, compared to growth in U.S. export to the European Union of about 25% during the same period. In 1996 alone, these exports grew by more than 14%, reaching $109 billion. That growth rate is more than twice the rate of growth of U.S. exports to the rest of the world. The results for the American economy? The economic news these days is almost uninterruptedly good. While obviously no one can credit all of this change to the expansion of exports, and investment in the countries of the hemisphere, it would nonetheless be preposterous to suggest that there were not a strong relationship. The American unemployment rate is at a 24-year low, below 5%. Since 1993, in fact, the U.S. economy has created almost 13 million new jobs, including more than 1 million in construction and another 500,000 in manufacturing. Exports from the United States have grown by nearly 50% since the beginning of 1993, up more than $300 billion after adjusting for inflation. Exports have accounted for almost 2/5 of the overall growth in the economy since 1993. The deficit, which was $290 billion in 1992 and $107 billion in 1996, has been replaced with a projected surplus. Instead of wrangling over how to fix the deficit, the argument now in Washington is about what to do with the extra money. Family income, having stagnated for almost 20 years, has begun to rise again. Since 1993, the income of the typical American family has increased by more than $1,600 a year after adjusting for inflation. The good news goes on and on. Exports of semiconductors have grown by 139% under the Clinton administration. Telecommunications exports have grown 113%. Exports of computers and computer-related goods are up 54% in that same period. The U.S. is once again the world's #1 producer of automobiles for the first time since the 1970s, and has regained its position as the #1 producer of semiconductors in the world. The continuation and expansion of these developments depends on our ability to promote the FTAA at the Santiago Summit and to take an active part in those negotiations. While this will be done in any event, The process would be greatly expedited and strengthened by the reestablishment of fast-track authority for the President. The failure to renew this authority has made potential trading partners somewhat reluctant to commit to serious negotiations with us. It would be nice to be able to say that this has had no effect on our economic prospects in the region, but the reality is otherwise. The lack of fast-track authority leaves America sitting on the sidelines as trade agreements are negotiated without our participation. This cannot help but affect our ability to create high-paying jobs, while blocking American workers from competing in the world on a level playing field. To cite just a few anecdotes, in November of 1996, Canada reached a comprehensive trade agreement with Chile, establishing Chile's 11% across the board, or pardon me, eliminating Chile's 11% across the board tariff. As a result, American telecommunications companies competing for contracts with Chile must do so at a significant disadvantage, still paying the 11% when Canada and Canadian firms are not. Venezuela and Chile have a trade agreement which allows fresh fruit from Chile to be imported into Venezuela for only a 2% duty. U.S. producers have already begun to complain because they must pay the regular 15% tariff. It has been estimated that the U.S. share of this market would grow from its current 39% to about 67% if American producers had equivalent access to Venezuelan consumers. But that requires the negotiation of a trade agreement difficult to achieve without fast track. The nations of the Andean Pact, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, comprise a market of about 100 million people and a GDP of over $260 billion. In developing a common external tariff, they raised their import tariff on textile goods, to cite just one example, from 5 to 15%. Without fast-track authority, the U.S. is unable to negotiate an agreement that would knock down this barrier to goods made by American workers in America, thus costing American jobs. Certainly, the U.S. businessman can locate his factory or his enterprise in one of the Andean countries and would be able to export from whatever Andean country that was, let's say Venezuela or Colombia, into another Andean country without paying any duty at all. But who's the loser in this? The loser is the American worker. The nations of Mercosur, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, comprise the largest market in Latin America, 200 million people and a combined GDP of $1 trillion. These four countries have entered into free trade agreements, raising tariffs on most imported items from outside of their boundaries. U.S. firms not located and producing within these countries face a competitive disadvantage, one that will necessarily grow as they expand their free trade zones. Accessing this market on even terms is a daunting task without fast track. Other countries have not been slow to appreciate the economic potential of the Latin American markets and the prospect of increased access via free trade. On the day that the President was forced to conclude that he would not ask for a vote on fast track in the House, that same day, Team Canada had just completed a trade promotion visit of truly astonishing scope. More than 450 delegates, Canadian delegates from business representatives, visited Mexico City, Sao Paulo, Brasilia, Buenos Aires, and Santiago. In Mexico alone, Canadian companies signed more than 90 agreements representing some $230 million in contracts. Other nations are mounting similar, if less exhaustive, approaches. This is not to suggest that we are unhappy to see the cause of free trade being advanced. Quite the contrary. Nor are we sorry to see Canada and the nations of Europe taking advantage of the economic opportunities afforded by free trade. But these are opportunities, and we would like to see American businesses and labor compete for them on an equal footing. To do that, we must be ready to move expeditiously towards our hemispheric goal of a free trade area of the Americas by the year 2000. And to accomplish that, we must have the tools necessary for successful negotiations. And those tools are the ability to be able to negotiate and to facilitate a vote in both houses of Congress through fast-track authority. I think one of the problems that we're facing is that the economy is so robust and in such good shape, and when you look at other markets, particularly Asian markets, and the fluctuations that they've been through over the last several weeks, one begins to get a sense that perhaps we should wall ourselves off as the best medicine against what might be the Asian flu. There is absolutely no way, given modern technology and modern economies, that that's possible. We have to compete. We have to become a greater trading nation than we ever have before. And the ability to be able to enter into negotiations and to conclude agreements is predicated on the ability to be able to present to Congress a package for an up or down vote, and that means fast track. And I thank you for your attention.
Let me just briefly thank the ambassador. He's agreed to answer questions until 10 minutes after 7.
The question is, what is my prognosis about our future relationship with Cuba? Cuba is one of those issues for the United States that's highly neuralgic, very emotional. If you have 5 people in a room, you have 6 opinions about what to do about Cuba. I think that much of it is predicated in U.S. law. The 1992 legislation, the recent 96 legislation, the Libertad Act, usually known as Helms-Burton, codifies a lot of what was in previous legislation and adds some more. Fundamentally, our sincerest hope is that the Pope's visit results in something long-lasting. Certainly, the Pope can speak about humanity and civil liberties and expression of the freedom of expression, religious expression, in a very authoritative way. Our sincerest hope is that Fidel Castro opened the society up to basic civil liberties afterwards. We're a fairly cynical group of people in terms of the possibilities. I would hope that there would at least, at a minimum, be religious expression that would be allowed after the Pope's visit. But Castro himself has even said, don't expect a lot of changes here, even as the Pope was still saying Mass in Havana. I think fundamentally our view is that the President has said several times, most recently during his trip to Latin America, that if the Cuban government was to open up and to allow for basic civil liberties and respect for human rights, that we would respond in kind. In other words, we would reciprocate, but that Cuba needs to make the first move. And the question is, what's going to happen next on the so-called war on drugs? I'm intimately involved in that issue, and I'd like to tell you that there's some very, very good news. I don't know whether it will translate into less drugs on the street, but I think it's probably the best start that we've had, or the best development that we've had in the last 15 years. And that is that drug production, or coca production, is down by 45% in the last 2 years in Peru. And that Bolivia has met its eradication targets for illegal coca production for the last 3 years. And what you're beginning to see is a real turnaround for a variety of reasons. I like to say that we finally convinced the Latins that even though we consume the drugs, that they've got to take their part of it seriously. I think that's part of it. I think the other part of it is that when they look at a country like Colombia that is really being overwhelmed by the influence of narcos, they begin to see that this is a domestic problem also, and they begin to take it seriously. Unfortunately, in the same year, coca production in Colombia went up 30%. I think our greatest problem right now is trying to find the resources to take advantage of the moment. And we have not had an increase in our resources in the last 8 years. So with inflation, we're probably dealing with 25% less money than we had even 7, 8 years ago on the drug fight. We're just not putting anything into it anymore, unfortunately, and it's been caught up in the balanced budget enterprise. Along with that, though, is a concept that has gotten real resonance on the part of the Latins, and that is Counter-Narcotics Alliance. It will be announced in Santiago at the presidential summit. It involves an alliance predicated on, as its central theme, a monitoring and evaluation mechanism that will likely be done by the OAS, and the United States will put itself into those categories, or that category of country that will allow itself to be monitored and evaluated. In other words, for all too long, the Latins have said, you monitor us and you certify us, or you decertify us in terms of our cooperation, but who's monitoring you? So when this gets off the ground, we will have, I think, a whole lot much more mature, and a whole lot more effective alliance against counter-narcotics than we've ever had before, based on kind of a shared responsibility for this. One of the things that I think you're going to see changing over the next couple of years, though, is less of an emphasis on the drug aspect of these criminal cartels, and more of a desire on the part of U.S. law enforcement and others to go after the criminal organizations themselves, regardless of what they're into. I think we're finding that a criminal organization doesn't just get into a certain kind of endeavor, an illegal endeavor, and say, well, that's where I draw the line, because I don't do illegal aliens or automatic weapons or weapons of mass destruction or whatever. They'll get into anything that the market will bear. And to take them out of the cocaine business, when in the United States, the use of methamphetamines, for example, which is a purely chemical drug, is on the rise, does not resolve the problem, because you've got a criminal cartel in these countries that are worth billions of dollars, even if you're to put them out of business tomorrow, that can suborn and threaten and hollow out from within democratic institutions. So there's going to be a whole lot more of a thrust towards trying to get at these illegal global gangsters. And why don't we do more for Honduras? I think that that globally speaking, we have a moment in history where the Cold War has ended, where most of the world is looking towards the United States to exert great leadership and to tailor and mold the world for successive generations. The United States, by and large, is not there. When it comes to effective engagement, when it comes to, as I mentioned earlier, fast-track authority, when it comes to doing the kinds of constructive things that need to be done, the United States is historically undergoing a real period of introspection. I mean, I can't tell you how elated I am to have you all here. But quite honestly, if you speak particularly with most members of Congress, you get a very strong sense that that foreign issues are not what gets them reelected. And so consequently, you either have them ignoring international affairs altogether, or oftentimes you have what I've begun to term, for lack of a better term, the pet rock issue syndrome, okay? In other words, a congressman will have a pet rock issue, whether it be Nicaragua and the confiscation or expropriation of U.S. citizen land there, or whether it be drugs in Thailand. And there are very few congressmen, and unfortunately too few senators, that you can turn to nowadays and say, we need your support for this, because it's part of our strategy, our global strategy, to advance our agenda in this way, and they understand. I mean, quite honestly, there's been such a turnover both in the House and the Senate over the last couple of years. The expertise on international affairs and the experience is less than I think it's ever been. And unfortunately, there's no real payoff for congressmen and senators to get engaged in international affairs, and they tell you that. And so consequently, we in the U.S. Foreign Affairs establishment find ourselves at a loss when it comes to trying to get support from Congress and from the American people. I'll also tell you that we are guilty, we in the Foreign Affairs establishment are guilty also, because for way too long we considered foreign affairs issues to be too complicated and too arcane and too esoteric for the average American to understand. And I think there's been a certain built-in arrogance. I think when you look at this current Secretary of State, you get a better appreciation for someone who can translate things in the kind of plain talk that they deserve to be projected in, and her outreach, particularly to the American public, is a #1 priority of the administration at the State Department. So to answer your question, the resources aren't there because we have had nothing but decreases in the what we call the 150 account, the foreign affairs account. Most people, when they're asked what percentage of the budget goes for foreign assistance, well, let me ask, what percentage of the budget would you say goes for foreign assistance? All right, you beat me to it. 1%. 1%. Pardon me? The United States Foreign Affairs budget, the foreign assistance budget for the United States has been less than 1% for the last almost 27 years. And when you talk to most people, not this distinguished group, of course, they will say that up to 13% would be acceptable. So we're dealing with 1%. And with 1%, you've got to get the counter-narcotics budget. You've got to deal with chaos and mayhem around the world. You're talking about our dues to the OAS and the UN. You're talking about the full range of things. And when you consider what we're getting out of our foreign affairs dollars, it goes a long, long way. In terms of Honduras, I wish we could give more money to Honduras. Honduras is relatively stable. They will have an inauguration to seat a new president, President Flores, this week. I wish we had more money to go around, but unfortunately, where our money usually goes are to those crisis points in those countries that are undergoing difficulty. We can't do any kind of wellness or remedial action. We just don't have it. The question is, what's the influence of Japan on South America? Yes, Frank, I repeated the question. I've been kind of a student of Japan for a long time. I've never served in Japan, but watching what they do. And what they do is very interesting. Of course, it's easier because they're a smaller country. They've got smaller industries, lesser amounts of companies that compete one against the other. But it's interesting because what they'll do, they will develop a strategy led by their foreign ministry for a particular region of the world. They will identify graduate students who are sent to that region to study. They study first the language, then they're usually sent either through private companies or through their version of the Peace Corps to serve in these countries. At the same time, they're gaining valuable information about the countries, the legal regimes, the companies that are up and going, the regions of that particular country which might be good markets for Japanese goods, etc. The Japanese assistance is usually in tied credits. In other words, a country will get $50 million to buy Japanese garbage trucks, okay? And what happens is they get the $50 million, but then 10 years down the road when they have to replace garbage trucks, they'll usually buy Japanese. And in the meantime, they're buying Japanese spare parts, okay? Then you have Japanese businessmen who go to Latin America, usually after many, many years of experience dealing with Latin countries because they've specialized through graduate school, as I mentioned. And they'll go to country X and they will offer the sale of their products or joint ventures or whatever it might be with exceptional terms, usually subsidized by the government of Japan. So basically what I'm saying is that the Japanese have figured out that, that you can approach this by having kind of a comprehensive integrated package where higher education feeds into government, which feeds into private sector, and it's all tied up pretty nicely. In Latin America, we have a competitive advantage. We've enjoyed healthy surpluses there for the last 12 years. I'd like to see us keep it. I'd like to see us do the same kind of thing that the Japanese do on a local level. There's absolutely no reason, for example, that the state of Maryland can't integrate its exceptional higher education with private sector and to emphasize foreign languages in the schools and foreign cultures and to do a better job. The question is, if they're successful, why don't we use our Peace Corps people in the same way? We should. We should. The primary reason for them to be out there is obviously humanitarian, but there's no reason why they couldn't be used in a commercial sense. I think probably there just needs to be a better integration of efforts, starting from federal government agencies all the way on down, and we've just got a long way to go. You know, when you look at the state of Maryland, for example, I had a meeting with James Brady, the Secretary for Commerce here, and we had an excellent meeting, and all the pieces are there. It's just a matter of the kind of leadership necessary to bring them all together. That's a very good question. The question is, why can't we negotiate a free trade agreement without fast track? Why do we have to have fast track? President Clinton is the first president in 14 years that does not have fast track authority. And the reason why you need fast track authority is to conclude an agreement. A country will not likely negotiate with you if they know that that agreement that they negotiate very hard to achieve has to pass through both houses of Congress and will be amended repeatedly throughout that process. What fast track does is it gets the legislation out there, and a member of Congress has only two options to vote, either for or against it. Can't amend it, can't touch it.
Does Canada have fast track?
Most countries have fast track.
Canada?
Yes. Yes. You have to, because if a congressman is able to amend a significant part of a negotiated free trade agreement, then you've got to go back to the negotiating country. It opens the door for all kinds of other amendments. It becomes unworkable. What are the prospects for democracy in Haiti long term? Any other questions? I think that that we are a whole lot more realistic when it comes to what are the essential underpinnings of democratic development than we ever have been. You know, I just see the expertise that we've developed, not just in strengthening and building democratic institutions, but across the board in terms of development writ large, just as good as it's ever been. I mean, we've learned a whole lot over the last couple of years. And I think when it comes to Haiti, there's some very good progress that's being done that has occurred over the last couple of years. I think that what you're talking about is getting in the area of changing attitudes in the way Haitian politicians do business. There are some bright signs on the landscape. In terms of economic development, they've begun a process to streamline their bureaucracy and to privatize. Foreign investment, particularly U.S. investment, is beginning to re-engage in Haiti. That will be, I think, the best way to provide some opportunities for Haitians as opposed to a raft. In terms of politics, that will take a lot more time. There is a prime minister who just resigned over an impasse that has gone on since April or May of last year over the elections for their Senate seats, an impasse that has yet to be broken. But they're dealing with it in a constitutional way. There is not blood running in the streets. They're hiring lawyers as opposed to hired guns, although in our country some would have difficulty making the distinction between the two. And it's going to be a couple of more years before the kinds of things that we associate with the rule of law and constitutional government really sink in a deep way. But it's happening.
Can we hang on that long?
Well, we Americans are not known for our patience. We look at a problem, we come in, we smack people around, we throw some resources at them, we tell them to straighten up, and then we like to leave. And sometimes it's just not so easy, and we can't leave that quickly. But as long as we understand that it took us a long time to establish our republic, to establish the rules of the game, and we can't expect anything more from other people, and that we're just going to have to stay the course. The question is, what benefits are there to trade with South America or Latin America and the Caribbean, and what specific industries might be more beneficial than others? I think it's kind of a global question because each one of these countries is in a different stage of development. That's something that's very, very important. Brazil, there are parts of Brazil which resemble New York City and developed Western Europe, and less Mexico or even Bolivia and other places. It's very, very, very different, very, very varied, very diverse in Latin America. I think that there are excellent opportunities vis-a-vis infrastructure and infrastructure needs. The estimate is that there are $3 million a day in infrastructure needs over the next 25 years that Latin America will need by way of bridges, roads, ports, airports, etc. Ogden International just won the privatization of all of Argentina's airports, a great win for the United States. But there are all kinds of opportunities vis-a-vis engineering and construction and that sort of thing. The advantage that we do have is that there is a whole generation of Latin American who is coming to the United States to be educated as never before. And so when a young student, a Latin American, comes to the United States for undergraduate and graduate school, he gets trained in our kinds of systems. He's familiar with our products and our companies. It's an entree as never before into the Latin American market. In terms of exports to South America, I think the high technology end. And joint ventures, particularly producing the lower technology end of our various industries, much the same as what you've seen in Mexico, but on a grander scale, particularly as it relates to places like Brazil and Argentina. I think there's virtually no products. I mean, I've been to some of the strangest events that you would think that a U.S. ambassador would be invited to. I've inaugurated multiplex movies in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and I was part of a inauguration of an Ace Hardware in El Salvador. I inaugurated a Wendy's in Quito, and a Subway in Quito. I'm there for all of them. There's really no limit. Once the tempo of travel to and from the United States even picks up, the appetite for U.S. products and services grows demonstrably. It's really phenomenal. I think you all probably heard that. Will the administration negotiate or try to get a vote on fast-track authority over the near term again, or will we abandon it, will we alter it, etc.? And I guess the right answer to that is we still haven't decided yet. There are some who are advocating for kind of a cut-down version of fast-track, limiting it to sectoral-type agreements in specific sectors, or limiting it to Chile, which actually was left standing at the altar twice now, waiting for us to get fast-track authority, limiting it just to Chile. I think the other side of that coin is, while it would be easier to get a sectoral or a smaller agreement through Congress, we started this whole debate in Latin America. We were the ones in Miami who said, free trade is great, we need you, you need us, we're going to forge partnerships, we need to advance this together, et cetera, and it's been us that have been, who stepped to the sidelines on this issue. And while they've gone ahead and done all kinds of great things, if we were to pass an abbreviated version or country-specific version, I think that probably it would be interpreted by the Latins as a lack of commitment for a free trade agreement by the year 2005. And I think probably the best thing to do would be to wait for the conditions to be right. Does the sale of a supercomputer to China threaten U.S. National security interests? I am not an expert on that sale, but I have to tell you that in those instances where I have been involved, particularly in a case to Italy several years ago, there is so much monitoring and follow-up that accompanies the sale of that kind of thing afterwards that a country has to agree to. I mean, when they buy this sort of thing and they get an exclusion from U.S. national security practices, they have to agree to allow unannounced monitoring and everything else. So I would imagine that that's going on in China too, and I would suspect that it would not constitute a national security threat. The question is, will the Asian financial crisis have a profound effect on the economies in Latin America? And I think the answer to that really lies in the fundamentals that are adhered to by these economies. I think that one of the good things that happened as a precursor to what's happening in Asia was the so-called tequila effect following the volatility in the Mexican market. All of these governments knew that they were susceptible to the same kind of volatility and went back to the so-called fundamentals, bringing their budget deficits in line, controlling inflation, narrowing the price band on their currency, opening trade, allowing for repatriation of money outside of the country, et cetera, et cetera. They've all pretty much gone back to the fundamentals after the Mexico experience. And so I think in a bizarre way, that experience had its very positive side with respect to getting them focused on the fact that no one is immune. And you've got to go back to fundamentals. But on the market side, there will be, and there are, things that have already come to our attention that the Latins have already lost out on in terms of potential sales towards Asia, particularly Thailand and Indonesia. Okay, the question is, will Mexico and Colombia be certified this year? And in the decertification for the second year of Colombia, were we contributing to an increase, that 30% increase in coca cultivation in Colombia, contributing to it by not being there in the way that we should to support counter-narcotics the way we should. I think when it comes to both countries, let me step back a year. Last year, just before certification, and we have to make our certification announcement to Congress by the end of February or by March 1, two things happened. One, in Mexico, the drug czar of Mexico, the Mexican Barry McCaffrey, was found to be corrupt and corrupted by narcos. And we found this out literally days before it happened. And there was this incredible reaction by Congress, as well as there should have been. I mean, Congress should have been incensed by this because, I mean, he is the principal, or was the principal Mexican interlocutor. It shows a number of things. Number one, it shows that the influence of narcotics traffickers has no limits, that even someone as high-ranking as this person could be suborned by drug cartels. But it shows a lot of other things with respect to Mexican maturity. First of all, it shows that they investigated this thing themselves and didn't run away from it. That they used the best investigative arm at their disposal, that the president bit the bullet knowing that this was right before certification and told us about it and went public with it, okay? Knowing that this would have terrible repercussions in terms of reliability and confidence in Mexicans, but knowing that it had to be investigated, that he had to get to the bottom of it. And I think that shows a great deal of maturity. It would have been so much easier to just sweep this whole thing under the rug and remove the guy and not say a word. But they didn't choose to deal with it in that way. Mexican cooperation on counter-narcotics has been good this year. I can't tell you how the certification decisions will come out, but I think we will look very favorably upon some very good things that have happened. Colombia, I think one of the reasons why they were decertified for the second year last year was the fact that while they had implemented a lot of laws, or pardon me, they had passed a lot of laws in their Congress that would help on the law enforcement side, they had passed them a week or two before we had to make our certification decisions. So we couldn't begin to tell whether they were serious in the implementation. This year, we've seen some steady improvement, I would say, in terms of the implementation. And I think that will be favorable for them when we make our when we make our determinations this year on Colombia. Has it affected our ability to do business here? There it has. There are nationalists in Colombia that bristle at us passing judgment on them. There are nationalists there who basically tell us what right do we have to pass judgment on Colombia when we're the largest consumer of drugs in the world. They're right. But we have to try to find a mechanism that does not waste the taxpayers' money either. We can't give assistance to a country that doesn't take it seriously, and that's the other side of that coin. The question is, could I explain the policy vis-a-vis the environment and cutting down the rainforest there? The policy is that we are for sustainable development and conservation. That has become, or has been, a major ingredient of our foreign policy throughout the hemisphere now for about 5 years. Ever since the first weeks of the first Clinton administration, it's been a high priority. It engenders the same debate as global warming and the Kyoto Conference engender, and that is the division between the developed world and the developing world, and the ultimate debate that gets around, well, if you want us to do better than you did in exploiting resources, give us the resources to do it in terms of alternative development, etc. What we're essentially saying to the developing world is, we don't want you to follow the model that we in the industrialized world followed. We want you to follow a model of sustainable development and conservation and cleaner environment, etc. And we want you guys to pick up the cost. And what they're saying is there's got to be some kind of middle ground here. And that's really what the Kyoto Conference was all about. It left it unresolved. And there still needs to be a whole component of what standards developing countries are held to. And that's still out there to be done yet. The question is, what is the U.S. position vis-a-vis Caribbean development, particularly as it relates to their #1 crop, which is bananas, as an alternative to the influence of narco-trafficking? Is that not correct? This is a very difficult issue for us because we don't grow bananas, but we export them, and we export them to the world. Del Monte, Dole, Chiquita are U.S. companies, so we do have a vested interest in that. I think one of the essential problems is that when the European Union did away with national quotas for bananas, there were quotas and tariffs on the national level, the expectation by U.S. business was that the banana market in Europe would grow dramatically. And so consequently, in anticipation of this, and this was 1992, plantations were expanded by leaps and bounds in Latin America and Central America, mostly in countries like Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras. And in anticipation that when these national quotas were eliminated by the Europeans, we would have a market for bananas. Unfortunately, what happened was, after the national quotas were eliminated, there was a licensing mechanism and a national quota mechanism which was established by the European Union writ large, which excluded a lot of dollar-based banana producers, which are in Central and Latin America. If any of you have traveled to Europe and wanted to buy a banana, you're astounded at the price that it costs. And the reason why it costs is because of an onerous licensing mechanism that's been put in place. For example, the Saudi Arabia of bananas is Ecuador. And Ecuador sells a box of bananas at about $12 a box. It pays $14 for a license to sell it. This product, this fruit, provides for a whole lot of jobs in Ecuador. And they're paying more for licensing for the privilege of selling these bananas. And what we'd like to see is that eliminated. Now, I do know that the WTO dispute panel has decided that licensing regime is illegal, and we are engaging with the Europeans on this. And we will agree to a short-term quota or a medium-term quota tariff system, which could be phased out over a period of time, at the same time that there could be alternative development schemes that could be launched in each one of these islands to produce other kinds of crops. The problem is that your bananas are good bananas, but competitively they're not as good as bananas grown on the mainland of South America and on the Isthmus of Central America. I just think that there's got to be a way of being able to provide strategies to move the Caribbean away from, particularly some of these islands, away from exclusive domination on bananas. For example, Dominica is almost a one-crop economy. And we're engaged with the Europeans and the islanders on that. And I do think that over the next couple of months there'll be an equitable strategy developed.
Let me, I apologize to those of you who would like to ask more questions, but we do have a rigid policy of ending at 7:10, of course, which we will do. I should note, in reference to one very small part of the ambassador's talk, that among the congressmen interested in foreign affairs still, of course, is our good friend Ben Cardin, who's been on our board, and he'll be speaking on the 7th of April, largely about his recent human rights tour in Eastern Europe, which should be interesting. In any case, I thought I'd take the opportunity to mention that. This has been an extraordinarily informative evening and very dense.
Thank you all. It's been a great group. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.